The night sky over the Arabian desert is absolute black. No moon, no stars visible through the thermal haze rising from the sand. A radio crackles, single word, contact, then silence. The kind of silence that means rounds are being exchanged, the kind that means men are fighting for their lives. Inside the operations center, 200 kilometers away, American commanders watch the thermal feed. What they're seeing doesn't match the intelligence briefing, doesn't match the tactical doctrine they taught, doesn't match anything in the SEAL playbook. One officer leans toward the screen, his jaw tightens. How are they moving like that? Somewhere in the desert sand, separated by a concrete wall and 60 meters of open ground, a British SBS operator has already fired 3 rounds. All 3 have found targets. The rifle, the one American commanders had openly mocked 2 months earlier, hasn't jammed once. The targeting computer displays the coordinates, each shot within 0.3 meters of where it needed to be. In this moment, watching men move with precision through darkness, watching a rifle system perform beyond specifications, everything changes. Nobody expected what happened that night, and when it was over, nothing would ever be the same between these 2 elite units. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to a moment when American confidence was absolute, back to when the jokes started. The base sits on the edge of Basra, a sprawling compound of concrete barriers, watchtowers, and hangars. This is where the world's most elite special operations forces train together, where egos are as thick as the desert dust. Navy SEALs from Team 3 had arrived 3 weeks earlier. 12 of the finest combat swimmers on the planet, men who had trained for 8 years to reach this level, men who had earned their right to be called the world's best maritime assault force. The selection process alone eliminated 92% of applicants. The final 6 months of SEAL qualification training saw another 30% ring the bell and quit. What remained were 12 individuals who represented the peak of human physical performance and mental toughness. They had cleared buildings in Ramadi, they had conducted underwater operations in the Persian Gulf, they had done things in places most people didn't know existed, they knew their capability, and they were secure in their knowledge. Then the SBS showed up, special boat service, British, quiet, professional, and carrying something that immediately caught attention, the AUGA-3, a bullpup rifle that looked like it belonged in a 1980s science fiction movie. Lieutenant Commander James Bradford, SEAL Team 3 Operations Officer, was in the briefing room when the comparison charts went up on the screen. The AUG next to the M4A1 carbine, side by side. The briefing officer, a weapons specialist from the Joint Task Force, launched into the technical analysis. The M4 had been the gold standard of close-quarters carbines for 20 years, modular, reliable, trusted by every special operations unit in NATO. The AR-15 platform, the foundation of the M4, had proven itself across 2 decades and 3 different wars. You could outfit it in 1,000 different configurations, you could swap barrels in 90 seconds, you could add optics, lights, grips, rails, unlimited customization possibilities. For operators who worked in radically different environments, this modularity was priceless. The AUG looked different, compact, almost toy-like. The bullpup design put the magazine and chamber far back, essentially in the stock of the rifle. Most SEAL shooters had never even held one. For men trained exclusively on the modular, expandable M4 platform, the fixed design of the AUG seemed almost crude. That's when the jokes started. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Red Henderson was the first. He held the AUG at arm's length during the equipment exchange, displaying it to the assembled SEAL team like a museum curator presenting an artifact from a failed civilization. This looks like something a video game designer made up. Where's the tactical rail? Where's the modular stock? Where are the... He paused, searching the rifle's profile. Oh, there isn't one. The comment drew laughs from 5 other SEALs in the armory, the kind of laughs that come from certainty, from the unshakable belief that you're right and everyone else is working with inferior tools. SBS Major Thomas Ashford, standing 6 feet away, didn't react. He simply nodded and said, "Right then," before walking to the ammunition storage. He had heard worse. He would hear worse before it was over. But the mockery didn't stop there. Over the next week, it evolved, escalated. "Bullpup, more like bullshit," one SEAL muttered loudly enough to be heard during a joint briefing. At the mess, another SEAL officer made a crack about the rifle's ergonomics. "Can't even reload properly. Your mag is buried in the stock. It's like someone designed a gun for people who don't actually shoot." The British operators heard these comments. They had to have heard them. The base wasn't that large. The compound measured 3.2 kilometers across. Sound carried, egos even further, but they never responded, never rose to the bait, never challenged the narrative. They simply maintained their professional demeanor, cleaned their rifles with methodical precision, studied their intelligence packets, and trained in the compound during the cooler hours before dawn. This restraint was misread as weakness by some. But Major Ashford understood something that distinguished him from most officers. He was the type of operator who didn't need to defend his equipment verbally. He had seen the AUG perform in 3 different theaters of operation across his career: in the mountains of Afghanistan, where temperature swings between day and night could jam standard rifles if they weren't properly maintained; in the jungles of Malaysia, where humidity corroded conventional carbine internals faster than most armories could replace them; in urban environments across Europe, where precision at intermediate distances mattered more than modularity and configuration options. The AUG had performed flawlessly in all 3 theaters. More than flawlessly, it had proven itself a solution to problems that modular rifles never fully solved. But he understood something the SEALs didn't yet understand. Confidence doesn't require defense. Excellence speaks through action, not words. Why argue about your rifle when you can just outshoot everyone else? The SEALs, by contrast, had trained exclusively with the M4. They knew its quirks. They could detail strip it blindfolded. They understood every modification, every upgrade, every possible configuration. They had customized their individual rifles dozens of times. One operator's M4 looked completely different from another's, each tailored to their specific role and preference. When your primary tool has served you well across 100 different operations, skepticism toward alternatives isn't just justified, it's practical. That's how the SEALs saw it. That's how most American operators saw it. The rifle had worked in Fallujah, it had worked in Kandahar, it had worked in the streets of Baghdad, it had worked in ambushes and raids and hostage rescues. Why would anyone switch to something untested, unknown, aesthetically bizarre? The mockery continued for weeks. It became the running joke of the Joint Operations Base. "Watch the Brits, see if their toy gun actually fires," one SEAL said during a range day. He said it loud enough for the British commander to hear. The British team overheard. A young SBS trooper, couldn't have been more than 26, looked at his sergeant. The sergeant shook his head slightly. Just 3 words communicated in that gesture: "Don't engage." That was the order. That was always the order. Professional units know when to fight. And this wasn't a fight worth having. By week 4, something interesting began to happen. The SEALs couldn't help but notice something they hadn't expected. Every single British operator could shoot. Not well, not competently, but with a precision that was frankly unsettling. It was the kind of accuracy that suggested not just training, but a fundamentally different approach to marksmanship. On the joint range, when both units conducted live fire drills, the accuracy differential became impossible to ignore. The AUG's built-in 1.5 times magnified optic gave it natural advantages for longer distances, yes, but at the close quarters ranges, 25 meters, 50 meters, the distances where carbines were supposed to dominate in SEAL doctrine, the British operators were converting shots with mechanically consistent precision. The standard was 6 shots at 25 meters from the shoulder in under 20 seconds. The SEALs achieved approximately 4 hits per 6 rounds under stress conditions. The SBS team achieved 6 hits per 6 rounds, and 3 of their operators had 6 hits in under 15 seconds. One SEAL sergeant pulled Henderson aside during a water break. "Their guys are tight, really tight. I don't care if their gun looks like a toy." Henderson nodded, not wanting to admit what he was seeing. The confidence that had seemed so justified 6 weeks earlier was beginning to develop small cracks. Not enough to break through, but enough to make the smartest men in the room wonder if they had dismissed something too quickly. Then came the intelligence briefing that changed everything. A high-value target had been identified 70 kilometers south of the base, in the desert region near the Iranian border. Not just any target, a weapons coordinator for one of the most active insurgent networks in southern Iraq, codenamed Viper. This man was responsible for at least 32 American deaths and double that number of Iraqi security force casualties. He had coordinated attacks on 3 provincial government buildings. He had supply lines running from Iranian Revolutionary Guard units. He was the kind of target that commands wanted to capture alive, wanted to interrogate, wanted to understand his network before taking down the rest of the cell structure. The briefing was classified, no details leaked, but word spread through the base the way it always does. 2 units, 200 kilometers, 72 hours until the operation kicked off. That's when the real test would come. That's what everyone was thinking. Major Ashford sat in his quarters the night before the operation briefing, reviewing satellite imagery on a secure laptop. He studied the compound layout, 3 buildings arranged in a triangle with approximately 40 meters between each structure. He noted the elevation changes, the approaches, the vegetation density. He was thinking like a commander, thinking about his men's survival. He didn't know yet that the SEAL commander, Captain Derek Sullivan, was in an adjacent tent having a different kind of conversation. Sullivan was speaking to his senior enlisted advisor, Master Chief Pete Garrett. "If this thing goes south," Sullivan said, "I want it on record that I had concerns about the composition of this operation." Garrett, a man with 23 years of service and the respect of every SEAL who had ever served under him, didn't say anything immediately. His face remained impassive. Then, "Sir, their reconnaissance is solid, their tactics are sound, and that rifle, after what I've seen on the range, I'd rather have them covering my 6 than worry about what they're carrying." Sullivan leaned back. "You think they're that good?" Garrett nodded with the certainty of a man who had seen combat in 5 different countries. "I think they're exactly as good as they need to be, and I think we're about to find out we made some assumptions." The operation briefing happened at 0600 hours. The target compound was located in a residential area, 3 buildings arranged in a triangle. Intelligence suggested Viper was in the central structure, civilians likely inside the adjacent houses. Rules of engagement were tight, precision required, no collateral damage acceptable. The SEALs would take the lead on the raid itself. That was the plan. The SBS would provide outer cordon security and prevent escape. Standard doctrine. The Americans would clear the main structure. The British would ensure no one escaped. It wasn't a bad plan. It was a sound plan built on operational concepts that had worked hundreds of times. But it was also a plan built on certain assumptions about capability hierarchy. As the briefing continued, Major Ashford listened without interrupting. His officer, Captain Michael Hayes, sat beside him, quiet and professional. When the briefing ended, neither man objected to the operational framework. They simply acknowledged it and began their own preparation. What the American commanders didn't see, because they weren't looking, was that the SBS team had spent the previous week conducting their own intelligence work outside the official channels. They had identified 3 additional compounds within the operational area that could serve as secondary escape routes. They had calculated wind drift patterns at different times of day using local meteorological data. They had mapped traffic patterns from local police reports. They had analyzed exit velocities from the main compound. They had done the work that good units do when they're preparing to support an operation, not lead it. They had made themselves unflinchingly prepared for what might happen if things went wrong. They had prepared for the contingency that nobody was officially allowed to plan for. 72 hours passed. The teams geared up in the pre-dawn darkness. Humidity hung thick in the air, the kind that makes sweat start before you've even moved. The SEALs conducted their final weapons check, magazines loaded with 5.56 NATO ammunition, suppressors threaded onto barrel extensions, optics zeroed at 25 meters, night vision equipment tested and powered up, radios tested on secure frequencies, everything by the book, everything documented. Beside them, the British operators were doing the same thing, but there was something else visible if you knew how to look for it. These men weren't just checking equipment, they were embedding contingencies. They were thinking 3 moves ahead. One SEAL lieutenant, observing from a distance, would later say the British team moved like they were solving a chess problem rather than preparing for a raid. The helicopters came in hot, kicking up dust that made visibility near zero for 30 seconds. The rotor wash created a temporary dust storm that obscured the landing zone. The SEALs fast roped down, hitting the ground in textbook formation, 12 men plus a Terp, moving with the efficiency of operators who had done this hundreds of times. They established a perimeter immediately, weapons oriented outward, ready for immediate engagement. The SBS team inserted from 2 separate helicopters, establishing positions 300 meters out, covering approaches and secondary exits. They moved with less urgency, but more calculation. Every position selected for maximum visibility and coverage. Every angle of approach anticipated. The initial assault went clean. Too clean. That was the first indication something was wrong. Thermal imaging showed no thermal signature in the central compound where intelligence said Viper would be. The bodies of people, you can see them instantly in thermal, would show up as bright white spots against the cooler background. There were none. The SEALs cleared the first structure in 6 minutes. Nothing, no weapons, no people, no evidence of recent occupation. The second structure in 4 minutes, empty, no weapons caches, no documents, no target. In the command center watching the thermal feed, someone said what everyone was thinking. "He's not here, he's already gone." Those 5 words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't detonated yet. The intelligence was wrong, or Viper had been tipped off, or the whole operation was a setup to draw out American units. That's when the radio crackled with contact report from the outer perimeter. SBS trooper, call sign Falcon 2. "Movement, tree line, 200 meters southeast. Vehicle engine just fired up. Looks like 3, maybe 4 individuals." The SEAL commander's voice cut through immediately. "Cavalry's still 4 minutes out. We're pinned in the compounds. You need to hold them." Falcon 2 responded immediately with 2 words. Contact, 2 seconds of silence, then single shots. Not rapid fire, not suppressing fire, single spaced shots. Each one calculated. The reason for the spacing became clear in the next 5 seconds. The vehicle, a white Toyota Technical with a PKM machine gun mounted on the bed, attempted to accelerate. First shot hit the front right tire at 200 meters. Vehicle lurched left. The driver panicked and overcompensated. Second shot through the windshield, driver's side. You could see the round perforation even in thermal. The vehicle swerved again, now moving erratically. Third shot went through the engine block. Radiator fluid sprayed into the desert night like metallic blood. What the Americans watching the thermal feed were seeing was something that violated every assumption they'd made about the operation. A single operator, Falcon 2, was stopping a 4-person escape team in a heavy vehicle using a rifle everyone had mocked. And he was doing it with surgical precision, with weapons platform stability that shouldn't have been possible at distance, with the kind of accuracy that required not just training, but a system specifically designed for this exact problem. One of the SEALs clearing the compounds heard the shots over the net, heard the spacing, heard the precision, and understood in that moment what was happening. The vehicle was still moving, but slower now, damaged, critical systems failing. Captain Hayes, the SBS, second in command, was already on his radio. Falcon 2, we're moving to intercept. Stand by. 2 SBS operators broke from their positions and moved toward the vehicle with the kind of speed that suggested they had trained for this exact scenario, which they had. 20 seconds earlier, they didn't know they would need to. But they moved anyway, because that's what good soldiers do. They prepare for the contingencies that haven't happened yet. The vehicle tried one more sprint. It made maybe 30 meters before Falcon 2's fourth shot took out the back left tire. The driver, identified later as a mid-level logistics coordinator for the insurgent network, panicked and bailed from the vehicle, running toward the nearest building. That's when it all converged at once. The 2 SBS operators intercepted him at 30 meters, controlled takedown, no shots needed. But then the machine gunner opened up from the vehicle bed, triggering a burst toward the positions where the British operators were established. This was the moment. This was when everything the SEALs had said about the AUG being inferior collided with reality. The AUG operates at 850 rounds per minute. The 1.5 times optic means you don't need to engage at distance if someone engages at you. And the ergonomics that the SEALs had mocked, the bullpup design with the magazine in the stock, meant you could return fire from behind cover with minimal exposure. Falcon 2 returned fire immediately. 4 rounds, controlled, precisely spaced. The machine gunner went down. Then Captain Hayes, now 50 meters closer, added 3 more rounds of precision fire toward the vehicle to suppress any remaining threats. In the thermal feed, watching from the operations center, what everyone saw was a tactical solution that shouldn't have worked, but did. A rifle that everyone had assumed was a compromise had just proven it was a solution to a different problem, a problem that most of the American operators had never actually considered. What happens when your primary doctrine fails? What happens when speed and modularity aren't the answer? What happens when you need precision first and everything else second? The cavalry, 2 Apaches that had been loitering 10 kilometers south, arrived 4 minutes later, but by then it was already over. The target was secured, the secondary escape team was detained, the vehicle was disabled, and the SEALs, clearing the compound where Viper was being held after expanding their search parameters, found intelligence materials that would lead to 14 additional captures over the next 90 days. But none of that is what the SEALs were thinking about when they linked up with the SBS team 30 minutes after the operation kicked off. Henderson was the first to say it. He walked up to Major Ashford in the pre-dawn light with his rifle slung and said, "I was wrong, your rifle, your guys, all of it, I was wrong." Ashford, showing more grace than the situation probably deserved, simply put a hand on Henderson's shoulder and said, "No drama, mate. We were all wrong about something tonight. You just figured yours out first." It was the kind of response that builds respect, that builds alliances, that builds the foundation for genuine professional relationships. Later, in the debrief, Captain Sullivan watched the thermal recordings of Falcon 2's precision fire. 4 shots from 200 meters while under time pressure. 4 targets neutralized or disabled with no ammunition waste. The commander who had questioned the SBS's role in the operation turned to his Master Chief and said nothing. Master Chief Garrett just nodded. They both already knew. They had both understood the moment those first 4 shots went down range. The technical report filed the next day was clinical and professional. 7 insurgents detained, intelligence package secured, 2 civilian casualties. Wait, no, 0 civilian casualties. The precision of the outer cordon security had meant that civilians in adjacent buildings never came under fire. The report noted that the outer perimeter team, using the AUGA-3 rifles, had achieved a 100% hit-to-shot ratio in the secondary engagement and zero collateral damage. In military documentation, that's not just good, that's legendary. That's the standard that becomes case studies in military academies. Within a week, the mockery had stopped completely, not because anyone formally announced it, but because the men on that base had seen something they couldn't unsee. They had watched a rifle system they had dismissed as outdated perform in conditions where their own primary weapon would have struggled. They had watched operators using that system make decisions that were faster and more precise than doctrine suggested was possible. They had learned something that should have been obvious but apparently wasn't. Superiority isn't found in the tool itself, it's found in the marriage between the tool and the man using it. Within months, the American command structure began quietly examining the AUG. Not to replace the M4, that wasn't practical at the scale of operations the military maintained, but to understand the principles that made the SBS team so effective: the bullpup design, the integrated optic, the simplicity of maintenance in austere conditions. By the end of the year, the Army had begun testing new rifle systems and concepts that incorporated lessons learned from observing Allied capabilities, the integration of optics, the emphasis on precision over modularity in certain roles, the acknowledgement that different tools solve different problems. Major Ashford and Captain Sullivan became close professional contacts after that operation. They attended the same conferences, they compared notes on tactics. Sullivan eventually advocated for including SBS training methodologies in the advanced courses at Dam Neck. Ashford reciprocated by forwarding after-action reports from British operations that highlighted lessons the Americans might have missed. This wasn't just military cooperation between allies, this was the birth of genuine mutual respect between two units that had started from a place of competitive dismissal. The raid became legend in special operations circles. Operators who had never been there heard about it. The story evolved slightly with each telling, as stories do, but the core remained unchanged. One British operator, one rifle everyone had mocked, and a moment where assumption collided with reality and assumption lost. Years later, on official recruiting materials for the SBS, there was no mention of that night. Professional operators don't brag, they don't need to. The men who matter already know. But within the community, the story persists. Henderson, who had initiated the mockery, went on to work closely with British counter-terrorism units in the years that followed. He became an advocate for cross-training with Allied forces. He would later say in an interview that one night taught him more about tactical humility than 20 years of training. "You can be the best in the world at what you do," Henderson said, "and still learn something from someone else who's the best at something else. The rifle was a symbol. What we really learned was that excellence doesn't have one shape." The weapons comparison that had seemed so obvious at the beginning, M4 versus AUG, American versus British doctrine, revealed itself to be far more nuanced than anyone had imagined. The M4's modularity made it perfect for the kind of versatile operations that American forces conducted globally across deserts, mountains, and urban environments simultaneously. The AUG's precision and integrated optics made it superior in specific high-consequence scenarios where accuracy trumped flexibility. Neither was universally better. Both were excellent. The real lesson was that the operators were what mattered. Give excellent soldiers excellent tools tailored to the mission, and excellence multiplies exponentially. Give average soldiers excellent tools, and you still get average results. In the following years, joint operations between American and British special forces increased substantially, not because of one raid, but that raid became the threshold moment. The moment when American operators stopped looking at British tactics as quaint tradition and started looking at them as professional alternatives worth studying. The moment when British operators stopped being quiet about their capabilities and started being vocal about sharing lessons learned. By 2012, 3 years after that desert operation, the first joint tactical manual was published, developed by both nations' special operations commands. It was titled Precision in the Asymmetric Environment. In the foreword, there was no mention of the raid. There was no mention of specific units or specific moments, but both authors, the American and British commanders who approved the manual, knew exactly what had prompted the collaboration. What that night really proved wasn't that one rifle was better than another. What it proved was that the best military organizations are the ones willing to challenge their own assumptions when evidence contradicts them. The SEALs could have dug in, could have rationalized the performance they had witnessed, could have claimed that the success was situational, not representative. Many military units would have done exactly that. Instead, the best ones, the ones that matter, looked at what happened and asked the hardest question an organization can ask. What were we wrong about? Once you start asking that question, you can't stop. It becomes part of your culture. And organizations that ask themselves that question, that seriously consider the answers, tend to be the ones that don't get surprised when they go into combat. The raid happened on a night when the temperature dropped to 14 degrees Celsius, when the wind came from the northwest at 8 kilometers per hour, when 3 insurgents tried to escape across the desert and couldn't, because a British operator with a rifle everyone had mocked decided that precision was more important than speed. The images from that night, the thermal signatures, the rifle muzzle flashes, the vehicle disabled on empty ground, are still classified. But the lesson isn't. The lesson is that sometimes the best weapon isn't the newest one. It's not the one that looks the most impressive. It's not the one that comes from your own military-industrial complex. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that works when everything else fails, and sometimes you have to watch it work before you believe it. The relationship between SEAL Team 3 and the British SBS never went back to what it was before that night, because you can't unsee excellence, you can't unhear precision, you can't unknow what you learn when your assumptions crash into reality. And that's the real victory of that desert raid. Not that the British team won an engagement, but that two elite military forces learned to respect each other by watching each other work. And in the community where these men operate, respect is the only currency that matters. It's the only measure that counts when your life depends on the person next to you.